There are missing children cases that end in tragedy. There are cases that end in miraculous recovery. And then there are cases so twisted, so layered with deception and horror, that the truth, when it finally emerges, is worse than anyone could have imagined. Welcome to Dark Case Files. I'm your host, and before we delve into one of the most disturbing child disappearance cases in American history, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The stories we tell here are the ones that reveal the darkest capabilities of human nature. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. This story takes place in rural Tennessee, but its horror is universal. Today, we're traveling back to 1896, to a small farming community in the Cumberland Plateau, to a 6-year-old girl named Maggie Thompson who vanished one summer afternoon, and to a nightmare that would unfold over the next 3 years, a nightmare involving false hope, sinister deception, and a truth so harrowing that even hardened investigators struggled to comprehend it. This is the story of little Maggie Thompson, the girl who disappeared twice, and the monster who took everything from her. Overton County, Tennessee, summer of 1896. Life in the Cumberland Plateau is hard farming rocky soil, enduring harsh winters and living in isolated communities where the nearest neighbors might be miles away. But it's also a close-knit world where everyone knows everyone, where church on Sunday is the social center of life, and where children can play freely without fear. The Thompson family, William, Sarah, and their 3 children lived on a small farm about 8 miles outside the town of Livingston. William worked their land and occasionally hired himself out for carpentry work. Sarah tended the house and garden, preserved food for winter, and raised their children. Thomas, age 10, Maggie, age 6, and baby Ruth, just 18 months old. Maggie was described by all who knew her as a bright, cheerful child. She had red gold hair, freckles across her nose, and an infectious laugh. She loved helping her mother in the garden, playing with her rag doll named Lucy, and following her older brother around as he did his chores. On July 14, 1896, a Saturday, Maggie's life took a terrible turn. That afternoon, Sarah was working in the vegetable garden while Maggie played nearby, picking wildflowers to make a bouquet. Thomas had gone to a neighbor's farm to help with haying. William was in town selling eggs and butter. Baby Ruth was napping in the house. Around 3 p.m., Sarah went inside to check on Ruth and to start preparing supper. She expected Maggie to come in soon. The child never wandered far from home. But when Sarah called for her daughter 15 minutes later, there was no response. Sarah went outside, calling louder. Nothing. She searched the garden, the barn, the chicken coop, the outhouse. No Maggie. She ran to the edge of the woods that bordered their property, shouting her daughter's name until her voice went hoarse. Panic rising, Sarah grabbed baby Ruth and ran to the nearest neighbor, nearly a mile away. The neighbor, Ezekiel Mitchell, immediately organized a search party. Within an hour, a dozen men from surrounding farms were combing the woods and fields, calling for Maggie. William returned from town just before sunset to find his farm swarming with searchers. His daughter was missing. His wife was hysterical, and nobody had seen Maggie since she was picking wildflowers in the garden. The search continued through the night by torchlight. By morning, word had spread throughout Overton County. Over 100 people joined the search farmers, townspeople, even the county sheriff and his deputies. They searched for 3 days. They found Maggie's rag doll, Lucy, at the edge of the woods about 100 yards from the Thompson home. But they found no other trace of the little girl. No footprints, no torn clothing, no sign of struggle. It was as if Maggie had simply vanished into thin air. Theories abounded. Had she been taken by a wild animal? The Cumberland Plateau had black bears and wildcats, But animal attacks on children were rare, and there was no blood or signs of violence. Had she wandered into the woods and gotten lost? But Maggie knew not to go into the woods alone, and an extensive search had found no trace of her. The most feared possibility. Had she been abducted? But by whom? There had been no strangers seen in the area. No one had any reason to harm the Thompson family. And why would someone take a child? After a week with no leads, the search was scaled back. After 2 weeks, most people assumed Maggie was dead, though her body had never been found. The community mourned. The Thompson family was devastated. Sarah Thompson never fully recovered from the loss. Neighbors said she would stand at the edge of the garden where Maggie had last been seen, calling her daughter's name, hoping for an answer that never came. 3 months passed. Then 6 months. Then a year. The pain didn't fade, but life had to continue. The Thompsons tried to rebuild some semblance of normalcy, though a part of them had died with Maggie. And then, in August 1897, 13 months after Maggie's disappearance, something extraordinary happened. A letter arrived at the Thompson home. It was addressed to Sarah Thompson, postmarked from Knoxville, Tennessee. Inside was a note written in childish handwriting. "Dear Mama, I am alive. A lady took me, but she is nice. She calls me Mary. I miss you. Please come get me. Your daughter, Maggie Thompson." The letter sent shockwaves through the Thompson family and the entire community. Maggie was alive. She had been kidnapped, but she was alive and had found a way to send word. The letter included an address in Knoxville, a boarding house on Cherry Street. William Thompson immediately contacted the sheriff, and together they made the 4-day journey to Knoxville. What they found, there would be the first of many strange twists in this case. The boarding house was run by a woman named Mrs. Ida Fletcher, a widow in her 50s. When confronted by William Thompson and the sheriff, Mrs. Fletcher initially denied having any child in her care. But when they showed her the letter and threatened to search the premises, she finally admitted that yes, she had a girl living with her. A girl she called Mary, but Mrs. Fletcher claimed the girl wasn't kidnapped. She said she'd found the child wandering alone on a road outside Knoxville over a year ago, dirty and frightened. Unable to clearly explain where she came from, Mrs. Fletcher said she'd taken the girl in out of Christian charity, had tried to locate her family without success, and had eventually decided to simply keep her and raise her as her own. The sheriff was skeptical of this story. But before he could press further, a girl appeared at the top of the stairs. She was about 7 years old, with reddish-brown hair, thin and somewhat pale. "Maggie!" William Thompson cried out and rushed toward her, but the girl shrank back, uncertain, frightened. She didn't run into her father's arms. She didn't seem to recognize him. William stopped, confused and heartbroken. "Maggie? Sweetheart? It's Papa. It's your father." The girl looked at Mrs. Fletcher, who nodded encouragingly. "It's all right, Mary. This man says he's your father. Do you remember him?" The girl studied William's face for a long moment. Then, tentatively, she said, "Papa?" It was enough. William swept her into his arms, weeping. The sheriff arrested Mrs. Fletcher on suspicion of kidnapping, and the girl whom everyone assumed was Maggie was taken back to Overton County. The homecoming was bittersweet. Sarah Thompson was overjoyed to have her daughter back, but something was wrong. The girl seemed different. She was quieter than Maggie had been, more withdrawn. She didn't play with her old toys. She seemed uncomfortable around her brother Thomas. She had nightmares and would cry out in her sleep. Sarah attributed this to trauma. Of course, Maggie would be changed by her ordeal. Of course, she would need time to readjust to her family. The important thing was that she was home and safe. But as weeks passed, doubts began to creep in. Small things that didn't quite fit. Maggie had been left-handed. This girl was right-handed. Maggie had been terrified of thunder. This girl seemed unbothered by storms. Maggie had a small scar on her left knee from falling on rocks. This girl's knees were unmarked. Most troubling, Thomas, Maggie's older brother, became increasingly insistent that this girl was not his sister. She doesn't sound like Maggie, he told his parents. She doesn't act like Maggie. Something's wrong. But William and Sarah didn't want to hear it. They had their daughter back. They weren't going to entertain doubts. Thomas must be mistaken or jealous, or simply unused to the changed Maggie. Meanwhile, in Knoxville, Mrs. Ida Fletcher was on trial for kidnapping. She maintained her story that she had found the girl wandering and had taken her in. But the prosecution argued that she had deliberately stolen Maggie Thompson and had kept her hidden for over a year. The trial became a sensation. Newspapers across Tennessee covered it extensively. And as reporters dug into Mrs. Fletcher's background, disturbing information emerged that Mrs. Fletcher had lived in Knoxville for only 3 years. Before that, she had lived in Chattanooga. And before that, in Murfreesboro. And before that, in Memphis. She moved frequently, never staying in one place more than a few years. And in each city, there were reports of a child living with her, always a girl, always around 6 or 7 years old, always called by a different name. The girls would appear and disappear without explanation. Neighbors would ask about them, and Mrs. Fletcher would give vague answers about relatives' children she was caring for temporarily. In Memphis, a girl who had lived with Mrs. Fletcher in 189-11892 had been identified as a missing child from Arkansas. But by the time authorities investigated, Mrs. Fletcher had moved to Murfreesboro, and the girl had disappeared. A pattern was emerging. Mrs. Ida Fletcher appeared to be a serial child abductor, taking girls from one area, moving to another city, keeping them for a year or two, and then what? What happened to the girls when they got older or became inconvenient? Authorities began a grim search for answers. As investigators dug deeper into Mrs. Fletcher's past, a horrifying picture emerged. Over a period of at least 15 years, she appeared to have abducted numerous young girls, moved them across state lines, and kept them in a cycle of captivity that ended somewhere. Somehow, the girls simply disappeared from record. But where did they go? Mrs. Fletcher wasn't selling them. There was no evidence of human trafficking. She wasn't adopting them out. No legal adoption paperwork existed. They just vanished. In November 1897, a breakthrough came. A woman named Martha Hendricks came forward in Nashville. She had been a neighbor of Mrs. Fletcher's in Murfreesboro in 1894. She testified that she had seen Mrs. Fletcher with a young girl who was sickly and thin, and seemed terrified of the woman. Martha had become concerned and had tried to speak with the girl when Mrs. Fletcher was out. The girl had whispered that her name was Annie, that Mrs. Fletcher had taken her from her family, and that she was too frightened to try to escape. Martha had gone to the police. But before they could investigate, Mrs. Fletcher had moved away, and the girl called Annie had never been seen again. Authorities began searching for girls who had gone missing in areas where Mrs. Fletcher had lived. They found at least 7 cases that matched. Young girls, ages 5 to 8, who had disappeared without a trace from communities within a day's travel of Mrs. Fletcher's residences. But they still didn't know what had happened to the girls. Were they still alive somewhere? Had they been sold or given to others? Or had something darker occurred? The answer came from an unexpected source. A man named Jacob Reeves, who had done occasional handyman work for Mrs. Fletcher in Chattanooga in 1895, came forward with a terrible story. He said that one night He'd been working late repairing Mrs. Fletcher's fence when he'd heard crying coming from the cellar of her house. He'd asked Mrs. Fletcher about it the next day. She'd told him it was just rats in the walls, but Jacob had been troubled by what he'd heard. It hadn't sounded like rats. It had sounded like a child crying. A few weeks later, Jacob had noticed that the girl who had been living with Mrs. Fletcher, a child she called Dorothy, was no longer around. When he asked about her, Mrs. Fletcher said Dorothy's aunt had come to take her back to her family, but Jacob had never seen any aunt. And he'd noticed that shortly after Dorothy disappeared, Mrs. Fletcher had him dig a new root cellar in her backyard, even though she already had a perfectly good cellar under the house. I didn't think much of it at the time, Jacob told authorities. But now, I wonder what I was really digging. Authorities obtained a warrant and traveled to Chattanooga to search the property where Mrs. Fletcher had lived in 1895. The house had new owners, who were horrified to learn of its dark history, but fully cooperated with the search dot in the backyard, where Jacob Reeves remembered digging the root cellar. Investigators began to excavate. What they found was not a root cellar. It was a grave. Inside were the remains of a child girl, approximately 7 to 8 years old, buried in a shallow grave. The bones showed evidence of trauma fractures that had occurred perimortem around the time of death. The child had been beaten and had died from her injuries. Further excavation of properties where Mrs. Fletcher had lived uncovered 2 more graves. 3 dead children. 3 girls who had been abducted, kept for a period of time, and then murdered and buried when they became too old or too troublesome. The horror of what Mrs. Fletcher had been doing for over a decade finally became clear. She abducted young girls, kept them in isolation, and when they reached an age where they might be able to escape or report what had happened to them, she killed them and buried them. Then she would move to a new city and find a new victim. Mrs. Ida Fletcher was charged with 3 counts of murder, in addition to the kidnapping charges. The trial, when it resumed in January 1898, was one of the most sensational in Tennessee history. But something else had emerged during the investigation, something that would shatter the Thompson family once again. The girl living with the Thompsons, the girl they believed was Maggie, had been examined by a doctor as part of the investigation. And the doctor had made a disturbing discovery. This girl was not 6 years old, as Maggie would have been when she disappeared. She was at least 8, possibly 9. Her bone development and dental age confirmed it. She had been much older than Maggie when Mrs. Fletcher had taken her, which meant that the girl the Thompsons had been raising for the past 5 months was not Maggie Thompson. She was another one of Mrs. Fletcher's victims, a girl who had been abducted years earlier, who had been coached to write that letter, who had been used by Mrs. Fletcher in a twisted scheme to avoid investigation. But if this girl wasn't Maggie, where was Maggie? The revelation that the girl living with the Thompsons was not their daughter devastated the family all over again. After months of believing Maggie had been recovered, they now had to accept that she was still missing. And given what had been discovered about Mrs. Fletcher's pattern of behavior, the likelihood that Maggie was still alive was vanishingly small. The girl who had been living as Maggie was interviewed extensively by authorities. Her real name, she finally revealed, was Elizabeth Carson. She had been taken from her family in Kentucky in 1893 when she was 6 years old. She had been with Mrs. Fletcher for 4 years. Elizabeth told investigators that Mrs. Fletcher had multiple girls at different times. She would keep them isolated, moving frequently, changing their names. She was cruel. They were beaten if they disobeyed, starved if they complained, locked in dark cellars if they cried for their parents. Elizabeth had been forced to write the letter to the Thompsons. Mrs. Fletcher had dictated exactly what to write. The plan had been to use the reunion as proof that Mrs. Fletcher was a kind woman who took in strays and tried to return them to their families. It was a calculated attempt to avoid prosecution for kidnapping, but the plan had backfired. The investigation it triggered had exposed Mrs. Fletcher's entire operation. Elizabeth also provided crucial information about other girls. She remembered at least 3 others during her time with Mrs. Fletcher. One, a girl named Sophie, had been with them in Knoxville, but had disappeared before the Thompsons arrived. Elizabeth didn't know what happened to her, but she had heard sounds from the cellar, crying, pleading, and then silence. A few days later, Mrs. Fletcher had taken a trip by herself, leaving Elizabeth locked in the house. When she returned, Sophie was gone. Based on Elizabeth's testimony, authorities began searching other properties. They found 2 more graves, one in Knoxville and one in Memphis. 5 dead children in total, all girls between 7 and 9 years old, all showing signs of violent death. But what about Maggie Thompson? With 5 dead children found and Elizabeth Carson recovered alive, where did Maggie fit in? Mrs. Fletcher, facing multiple murder charges, finally broke. In a jailhouse confession to her attorney, she admitted to taking Maggie Thompson from the garden that July day in 1896. I saw her playing alone, Mrs. Fletcher said, her voice flat and emotionless. Pretty little thing with red hair. I called to her, told her I had a kitten in my wagon, asked if she wanted to see it. She came over, sweet and trusting. I put a cloth with chloroform over her face. She went to sleep. I put her in the wagon under a blanket and drove away. Nobody saw. Nobody suspected. Mrs. Fletcher had taken Maggie to a house she was renting in Cookville, about 30 miles from the Thompson farm. She'd kept the girl there for about 6 months. But Maggie had been difficult. She cried constantly for her parents, refused to answer to a new name, and tried to escape multiple times. She was too much trouble, Mrs. Fletcher said. Too willful. Too old to be properly trained. I couldn't risk keeping her. In January 1897, 7 months after Maggie's abduction, Mrs. Fletcher had killed her. The method was brutal. She had beaten the child during a rage when Maggie had tried once again to run away. Maggie had died from her injuries. Mrs. Fletcher had buried the body on the property in Cookville and had moved to Knoxville shortly after. Taking Elizabeth Carson with her, authorities searched the property in Cookville. They found a grave in the backyard, beneath where a chicken coop had once stood. Inside were the skeletal remains of a small child, a girl, approximately 6 to 7 years old. The remains were examined by doctors. The bones showed evidence of severe trauma, and among the remains was something that made identification certain, a small metal locket on a chain. Inside the locket was a tiny photograph, a family portrait of William, Sarah, Thomas, and baby Ruth Thompson. And on the back, engraved in careful letters, was, "To Maggie, with love, Christmas 1895. Little Maggie Thompson had been found. But she had been dead for almost 2 years. She had died alone and terrified, beaten by a monster, buried like garbage, while her family had searched desperately for her, and then had briefly, cruelly, been given false hope that she was alive. The Thompson family's grief, which had begun to heal with the false reunion, was ripped open again. Sarah Thompson reportedly never spoke another word after receiving the news. She simply shut down, retreating into silence and eventually into an asylum, where she died 2 years later of what was then called melancholia, but which we would now recognize as severe traumatic depression. William Thompson tried to hold his family together, but the tragedy had broken him. He sold the farm. He couldn't bear to look at the garden where Maggie had been playing when she was taken. He moved to Livingston with Thomas and Ruth, trying to start over, but the shadow of what had happened never left them. Mrs. Ida Fletcher's trial was swift and conclusive. She was found guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of kidnapping for Elizabeth Carson, the only victim who survived. She was sentenced to death by hanging. Throughout the trial, Mrs. Fletcher showed no remorse. She sat impassively as victim after victim was discussed, as grave after grave was described, as family after family testified about their stolen daughters. When asked by the judge if she had anything to say before sentencing, Mrs. Fletcher simply said, "I have no regrets. I did what I had to do." What did she mean by that? Psychologists and criminologists have debated this for over a century. What possible justification could there be for abducting, torturing, and murdering children? Some have speculated that Mrs. Fletcher had lost children of her own and was trying to replace them, but became enraged when the abducted girls didn't live up to her fantasies of what a daughter should be. Others have suggested she was simply a sadist who enjoyed the power and control she had over helpless children. Modern psychological analysis suggests Mrs. Fletcher was likely a psychopath, someone completely lacking in empathy, who saw other people, especially vulnerable children, as objects to be used and discarded at will. Whatever her motivation, Mrs. Ida Fletcher was executed on April 15, 1899, at Tennessee State Prison. She was 54 years old. She went to the gallows without confessing to any additional crimes, though authorities suspected there were more victims who had never been found. Elizabeth Carson, the girl who had briefly lived as Maggie Thompson, was eventually reunited with her own family in Kentucky. They had never stopped searching for her. The reunion was bittersweet. Elizabeth was deeply traumatized by her 4 years in captivity and never fully recovered. She lived a quiet, withdrawn life and died in 1932 at age 45. The Thompson family never fully recovered either. Thomas Thompson, Maggie's older brother, became obsessed with protecting his younger sister Ruth. He never married, never left Livingston, and spent his life ensuring that Ruth was safe. He died in 1945. Ruth Thompson, who had been just a baby when Maggie disappeared, grew up knowing the story of the sister she never really knew. She became a teacher and dedicated her life to child welfare, working to establish better protections for children in Tennessee. She lived until 1978, carrying her family's tragedy with her, but channeling it into positive action. William Thompson never remarried after Sarah's death. He lived alone, working as a carpenter, and was known as a quiet, sad man who rarely smiled. He died in 1919. On his deathbed, he reportedly said Maggie's name and reached out his hand, as if grasping for someone only he could see. The case of little Maggie Thompson had lasting impacts on Tennessee and beyond. It led to several important changes in how missing children cases were handled. First, it established the precedent for multi-jurisdiction cooperation in child abduction cases. Mrs. Fletcher had operated across multiple counties and states, and local authorities had been unable to see the pattern. The Thompson case led to better communication and record sharing between law enforcement agencies. Second, it raised awareness about the vulnerability of children to predators. The image of the safe, idyllic countryside where children could play freely was shattered. Parents became more cautious, more vigilant. Third, it led to Tennessee establishing one of the first statewide systems for tracking missing children and disseminating information about abductions. The case also became touchstone for discussions about the death penalty. Mrs. Fletcher's execution was one of the few times a woman was executed in Tennessee, and it sparked debate about whether executing women, even those guilty of heinous crimes, was appropriate. In Overton County, the case became part of local lore. The Thompson farm, abandoned after William sold it, eventually fell into ruin. Local children were warned never to go near it, told that it was haunted by the ghost of little Maggie. still waiting in the garden where she was taken in 1996. On the 100th anniversary of Maggie's abduction, the community of Livingston erected a small memorial in the town square. It's a simple stone marker with Maggie's name, her dates, 1890 to 1897, and an inscription, "Taken too soon, never forgotten. May all children be safe." I visited Livingston, Tennessee in 2024, 128 years after Maggie Thompson was taken. The town has changed dramatically. It's larger, more modern, connected to the world in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1896. But the memorial to Maggie still stands in the square, flowers often placed at its base by people who remember the story. I also visited the site of the Thompson farm. It's private property now, but the current owner, who knows the history, allowed me to walk the grounds. The farmhouse is long gone, but you can still see where it stood. And you can see the garden, or rather, where the garden was. It's been reclaimed by forest, but if you know what to look for, you can still see the old fence posts, the outline of the vegetable beds. I stood there for a long time, trying to imagine that July afternoon in 1896, a little girl with red gold hair, picking wildflowers, singing to herself, completely unaware that a monster was watching, that within minutes her life would be stolen from her, that she would die alone and terrified, that her family would be destroyed by grief, and that her story would echo through generations. The case of little Maggie Thompson is harrowing not just because of what happened to her, but because of what it represents. She was taken from a place where she should have been safe, by someone who seemed harmless, in a moment when no one was watching closely enough. And she paid for that moment of inattention with her life. How many Maggie Thompsons have there been over the years? How many children have been taken by predators who moved from place to place, staying ahead of investigations, killing and burying their victims before anyone connected the dots? We've made progress since 1896. We have Amber Alerts, national databases, forensic technology that Mrs. Fletcher could never have imagined. But predators still exist. Children are still taken, and families are still destroyed by loss. The story of Maggie Thompson is a reminder that vigilance is not paranoia, it's responsibility. That teaching children about danger is not stealing their innocence. It's giving them the tools to protect that innocence. And that when a child goes missing, every moment matters. Every piece of information matters. Every witness matters. This has been the story of little Maggie Thompson, a 6-year-old girl who was taken from her family's garden on a summer afternoon and murdered by a serial killer who had been operating for over a decade. A case that exposed one of the most prolific child killers in American history and led to reforms that may have saved countless other children. Thank you for listening to this incredibly difficult episode of Dark Case Files. Cases involving children are always the hardest to research and present, but they're also some of the most important. They remind us why protection of the vulnerable matters, why we must remain vigilant, why we can never assume that it can't happen here. If you made it through this entire episode, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future cases. And share this video not for shock value, but to honor Maggie's memory and to remind people that these cases are real, that the victims were real children with families who love them. Leave a comment and tell me, how has child safety changed since 1896? What more can we do to protect vulnerable children? How do we balance safety with allowing children to have freedom and normal childhoods? And if you see something suspicious, if something about a situation involving a child doesn't feel right, speak up. Report it. Better to be wrong and embarrassed than to be right and silent. Rest in peace, Margaret Maggie Thompson. You deserve to grow up, to go to school, to fall in love, to have children of your own, to grow old surrounded by people who loved you. Instead, Your life was stolen by evil. But you are not forgotten. Your name is remembered. Your story is told. And because of what happened to you, other children have been protected. Until next time, stay watchful, stay compassionate, and never stop fighting for those who can't fight for themselves. Because every child deserves to grow up safe, loved, and free. This has been Dark Case Files. I'm your host. And little Maggie Thompson's story, as heartbreaking as it is, must be told so that we never forget what evil looks like, and so that we remain forever committed to protecting the innocent. Remember her name, honor her memory, and keep our children safe.